Have you ever wondered what you can do with an old curtain? Well, today I'm going to show you how you can transform a printed plaid curtain into a glamorous Vivienne Westwood style dress. All you need is a lightweight printed curtain, some sewing patterns, and intermediate sewing skills. Let's dive right in. Let's start by talking about the materials. For this dress, it's best to use a fabric that is lightweight and stable with some drape. I found this lightweight purple plaid curtain at my local thrift store for only $3. As you can see, the material is fairly lightweight, almost semi-sheer, like a heavy gauze fabric. It also has a nice drape and flow to it. Now this is the kind of curtain that you want to use for this dress. You don't want to use a curtain made out of a heavy, stiff fabric like the kind that are used for blackout shades. If you have that kind of curtain and really want to refashion it, check out my orange jacket project, where I transformed a medium weight cotton curtain into a tailored jacket. I'll include a link to that project in the description for this video. Now the Vivienne Westwood dress needs a lot of fabric, so you'll need at least 3 yards of fabric that is at least 60 inches wide. For reference, my curtain panel measures 96 inches by 72 inches. And I was just barely able to squeeze all the pieces I needed out of the fabric. The good news, however, is you don't need any lining fabric because the bodice is lined in self fabric and the skirt isn't lined at all. Now let's talk about patterns. I couldn't find any ready-made patterns for a Vivienne Westwood style corset dress, so instead we're going to use Vogue 8385 for the bodice pattern, plus a skirt pattern that I draped myself. Vogue 8385, unfortunately, is now out of print, but you can still find it online through Etsy, Amazon, or eBay. I bought mine from a shop on Amazon called Patterns from the Past. We'll be using View B, which features an amazing draped neckline that I could never figure out how to drape myself. The skirt is essentially a large 60-inch square with a circle cut out of the middle. I've added a point to one side of the circle, so the skirt fits the V shape at the center front of the bodice. You can download a pattern that shows the shape of the circular hole and the location of the pleats for free on my website. I'll add a link to that in the description to this video. I'll show you how to use the pattern later in this tutorial. For now, just know that my skirt pattern is for a finished bodice with a waist circumference of 28 inches. But you can easily adapt the pattern to fit a wider or smaller waist simply by adjusting the sizes of the pleats or even removing a few pleats altogether. Now, in addition to the patterns, you'll need a few specialty items to make the corset of the dress. First, you'll need some 1/4-inch spiral steel boning. You can order these from suppliers pre-cut to specific lengths. They have rounded tips that are added so the boning doesn't poke through and create a hole in your fabric. You can also find plastic boning online, but I recommend using spiral steel boning instead because it is more flexible and comfortable to wear. You can see here I've got some spiral steel boning and some plastic boning, and the spiral steel boning is much more flexible. The specific lengths of boning you need will depend on the size of bodice you're making. So I recommend making up your muslin of the bodice, which we'll talk about next, making any adjustments you want to make, and then measuring your final bodice to determine the lengths of boning you will need. Don't forget to subtract the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on either side. For reference, I cut a size 12 bodice, tapering to a size 10 at the waist, and I needed 2 7.5-inch, 2 8-inch, 1 12.5-inch, and 2 13.5-inch lengths of spiral steel boning. You'll also need some hook and eye tape, which we'll use to close the front of the bodice. As originally drafted, Vogue 8385 calls for the bodice to be closed with buttons down the front. However, I wanted this dress to have a corset that's cinched in at the waist, and for that, you need something that is more secure than buttons, and it can withstand the pressure of cinching in your belly fat. Hook and eye tape accomplishes that. The tape typically comes in black or white, with the hooks and eyes spaced about 1 inch apart. I used some black hook and eye tape for mine, as that blends in with the fabric for my dress better than white would. Next, you'll need 7 buttons that are 1/2 inch wide. I've got here both black and red buttons, as I'm not sure yet which color will look best on the dress. These buttons will go down the center front of the bodice. They're purely decorative, as the bodice will now be held together using hooks and eyes instead of the buttons, so you can leave these out if you prefer. Finally, you'll need some small snaps to secure the skirt to the bodice at the front. I'm using these black 1/4-inch snaps, but you can use any size and shape you want. For the dress itself, you'll need 2 sets of snaps, and if you decide to add some bra strap holders to your dress, which I'll talk about in a bit, then you'll need another 2 sets of snaps. Okay, now that we've gathered all of our materials, let's move on to the next step, making a muslin. Now I know what you're thinking. Do you really have to go through the hassle of making a muslin? Trust me, I hear you. I normally skip making muslins, but for this dress, you really need to make a muslin of at least the bodice, because it's very fitted and we're converting the bodice into a corset. So you'll want to check that the bodice cinches you in at the waist without being unbearably uncomfortable. So just take my word for it and don't just cut your normal size. For example, for me, I ended up cutting a size 12 in the bust, tapering down to a size 10 at the waist, because I wanted to cinch in the waist more than I normally would. This is the exact opposite of what I would normally do with Vogue patterns. Normally, I'd cut a size 10 in the bust, tapering to a size 12 at the waist. Another tip on making the muslin. Ordinarily, I would skip the lining on my muslin, but for this one, you really need to cut out and sew both the exterior fabric pieces and the lining pieces. That's because this bodice has an unusual construction at the neckline, and you need the lining pieces for the bodice to drape as it is intended. The plus side is you could use the muslin as an opportunity to practice the construction of the neckline and straps, which can be a bit tricky. Once you've made your muslin, baste in the hook and eye tape, making sure to place the hook and eyes on the center front line. Then, try the muslin on and make any fitting adjustments you need to make. Here are a few common fitting issues with this bodice. The back neckline has a tendency to gape. To check that on your muslin, make sure you've pulled the straps to the ends of your shoulders. The straps on this bodice are intended to be wide set. After you've done that, if the back neckline still gapes, consider adding a small dart at the neckline or making a straight back adjustment, which is what I did on my pattern. The armholes on this bodice are cut uncomfortably high, so I recommend lowering the armholes. I ended up redrawing the armhole about an inch lower than the armholes in the original pattern. Make sure that the waistline of the bodice sits at your natural waistline. Otherwise, the dress won't be as flattering. For me, the waistline on the bodice was a bit too high, so I lowered it by 1/2 inch. Once you've perfected the fit on your muslin, transfer your adjustments to your pattern, and then it's time for the fun part, cutting out the actual dress.
Before we start cutting our pieces, you might want to unpick any existing seams on your curtain. For example, many curtains have a pocket running along the top of the curtain, which the rod is supposed to go through. You can also skip the unpicking in the beginning and only unpick the seams when and if you find that you are laying your pattern pieces over the seams. Now let's start cutting the front bodice. You'll see the grain line marked on the pattern piece calls for the bodice to be cut on the bias or on the diagonal grain, which we need in order for the neckline to drape properly. Line that grain line up with your fabric. Here, I'll be lining it up with the stripe in the plaid. Then, fold the pattern at the center front line and check where the print will fall on the center front. Make sure you like that print placement. For example, I tried to place one of the intersections of the plaid at the V of the bodice, just because I think it looks nice and neat that way. Then, pin the pattern in place and cut the piece out. To cut the other side of the bodice, flip the pattern over and line up the print in your cut piece so it matches exactly with the fabric. It can take some time to get the placement exactly right, but it's worth it because you'll end up with an exact mirror image if you take the time to do this. Once you've lined up the print, pin all along the edge of your cut piece. making sure to keep the print aligned. I like to use a pin at every place where there's a significant print motif that needs to be aligned. So here, for example, I pinned at each one of the bold, colorful stripes going down the fabric. Once you've finished pinning, cut out the other side of your bodice. Next, cut out the back bodice. Here, we need to try to match the print along the curved side seam in the front and back bodice as best we can. I do this by folding 5/8 of an inch of the back bodice pattern in, so I get to the seam line. Then do the same in my front bodice piece, again to get to the seam line. I then line up my back bodice piece to the front bodice piece at the side seam and mark the plaid lines in the middle of the seam. With this plaid, I won't be able to get an exact match on the entire curve, so I just line up the middle because that's going to be the most visible part when the garment is worn. Then, I line up the lines that I marked on the pattern with the plaid in the fabric, making sure that my pattern is placed on the straight grain this time. I pin the pattern in place, then cut out 1/2 of the back bodice. I then flip the fabric over and match the print again, then pin and cut out the other half of the back bodice. I do this instead of cutting the piece on the fold, so I can control where the print goes and get an exact mirror image on the back bodice. Once you're done cutting, you should have front and back bodice pieces with the print matched up along the side seam. Once you have cut out one set of front and back bodice pieces, cut another set for the lining. Next, transfer all markings from the pattern to the cut fabric pieces. After you've done that, make a mark on the left front bodice piece, 4 inches from the center front. You'll be sewing a snap here eventually. You'll also need to mark the boning channels on the back bodice. You can add boning channels wherever you like, but for me, I added boning channels about 2.5 inches on either side of the center back. I also added another set of boning channels about 2 inches from the first set of boning channels. Now let's move on to the skirt piece. Start by cutting a square that is 60 inches on all sides. Find the center point of the square by folding the square in half and then folding it again. Mark that center point. And then take the skirt pattern piece and place it on your fabric square, lining up the center point and the grain line. Transfer all markings to the fabric. Next, cut out the hole in the middle of your fabric. On the pattern, the solid line is the stitching line, and the dotted line is the cutting line. Make sure you cut along the dotted line in the fabric, so you end up with enough seam allowance to sew the skirt to your bodice. And that's it! We finished cutting out the pieces of the dress. Check out part 2 for step-by-step instructions on how to construct the dress.